The cigarette smoke curled upward in the dim light of the Brussels safe house as Captain James Mitchell studied the photograph for the 100th time. March 1943. The face staring back at him belonged to a man who didn't exist, at least not according to any official record. That man was now him. 6 weeks earlier, Mitchell had been teaching cryptography at a military intelligence facility in Hampshire. Now he sat in occupied Belgium with forged papers identifying him as Henrik Vandewalle, a Dutch freight supervisor working for the German Railway Administration. The transformation had been meticulous. His handlers had spent 3 weeks drilling him on Dutch dialects, German railway procedures, and the peculiar bureaucratic language the Nazis used for their logistics networks. They'd even broken one of his fingers and reset it poorly, matching an old injury in the real Vandewalle's medical records, a man who died in a Rotterdam bombing. His death conveniently never registered. The mission brief had been simple in concept, terrifying in execution. German supply lines running through Belgium into France were operating with impossible efficiency. Allied bombing raids weren't making the expected impact. Intelligence suggested someone was feeding the Germans advance warning of airstrikes, but there was something else. Shipments were moving through the network that didn't match any known German logistics patterns. Weapons. Perhaps. Chemical agents? Possible. The analysis suggested something more valuable. Industrial machinery and technical specialists, likely heading to secret research facilities. Mitchell's assignment was to penetrate the railway administration in Antwerp, identify what was moving through the hub, and if possible, discover the source of the intelligence leak that was costing Allied bomber crews their lives. The safe house contact, a Belgian woman named Marie who claimed to be with the resistance, had left him an hour ago. She provided his work assignment. He was to report to the Antwerp South Freight Depot at 6 the next morning. She'd also left him something else, a warning. 3 British agents had disappeared in Antwerp in the past 4 months. The Gestapo had a source inside the resistance network, or perhaps the network itself had been compromised. "Trust no one," she'd said. Then she'd smiled grimly and added, "Not even me." Mitchell stubbed out his cigarette and checked his pocket watch. 3 in the morning. In a few hours, he'd step into the role completely, and any mistake, wrong phrase, an unfamiliar procedure, even an inappropriate reaction to a joke, could mean a basement interrogation room and a bullet behind the ear. He lay back on the narrow bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, his mind wandered to the training, to the moment his handler, Colonel Davies, had pulled him aside after a particularly brutal practice interrogation. "The key to deep cover work isn't learning to lie convincingly," Davies had said. "It's learning to stop lying altogether. You need to become the person in your papers. Your cover identity isn't a mask you wear. It's who you are. James Mitchell needs to cease existing until this mission ends." At dawn, Mitchell, now fully inhabiting his identity as Henrik Vandewalle, made his way through the streets of Antwerp. The city bore the scars of occupation. German soldiers on every corner, propaganda posters plastered on walls, Belgian citizens moving with the particular wariness of people living under constant surveillance. He'd memorized the route, but he let himself pause occasionally, studying shop fronts with the casual interest of someone familiar with the area, but not intimate with every detail. The freight depot was a maze of rail lines, warehouses, and administrative buildings. Mitchell reported to the supervisor's office, a gray concrete structure that smelled of coal dust and machinery oil. The supervisor, a heavy-set German named Hauptmann Richter, barely glanced at his papers. "Vandewalle, you're replacing Jurgens. Heart attack, poor bastard." Richter's Dutch was serviceable but heavily accented. "You will be responsible for documenting incoming freight manifests, reconciling them with outgoing shipments, and maintaining the daily logistics reports. Simple work. I trust you understand the importance of accuracy." The implicit threat was clear. Mitchell nodded. "I've worked railway logistics for 8 years, Hauptmann. You'll have no complaints." "Good. Your desk is in the corner. Get familiar with yesterday's reports. I want you operational by this afternoon." The work itself was mind-numbingly bureaucratic, exactly what Mitchell had hoped for. Freight manifests, bill of lading forms, customs declarations, all creating a paper trail of everything moving through Antwerp. But within hours, he began noticing anomalies. Certain shipments had minimal documentation, just reference numbers and destination codes. These shipments always moved at night, always on specific rail lines, and always with military escorts that seemed excessive for ordinary cargo. More interesting was the pattern. Every 7 to 10 days, one of these mystery shipments would pass through, always departing between 11 at night and 3 in the morning. The timing coincided with periods when Allied reconnaissance flights were least likely. Someone with access to British operational planning was coordinating this schedule. Over the following weeks, Mitchell settled into his role. He learned the rhythms of the depot, the personalities of his co-workers, the small corruptions and black market trades that existed in every corner of occupied Europe. He cultivated relationships carefully. Richter was a by-the-book administrator who drank too much and complained about his wife in Berlin. The assistant supervisor, a Belgian collaborator named Luc de Vos, was ambitious and resentful, always angling for more authority. The French secretary, Amélie, was quiet and efficient, her eyes containing a carefully suppressed hatred that Mitchell recognized immediately, a patriot forced into service for the occupiers. He also began to notice surveillance. Nothing obvious, just the repeated appearance of certain faces. A man in a brown coat who seemed to be at the same cafe every morning. A woman with the distinctive red scarf who appeared on his route home multiple times. Professional watchers, possibly Gestapo, possibly resistance vetting him, possibly both. Mitchell maintained his routine flawlessly. He ate at the same places, drank at the same pubs, expressed the appropriate level of disinterest in politics that characterized most occupied populations trying to survive. But at night, alone in his boarding house room, he carefully documented everything he'd learned in a cipher known only to a handful of British intelligence officers. The breakthrough came in his 5th week. Mitchell was working late, processing a backlog of manifests, when de Vos entered the office. The Belgian was drunk, unusual for him, and in a talkative mood. "You know what I hate about this job, Henrik." De Vos didn't wait for an answer. "We're just clerks, shuffling papers, while real men make history. You know what moves through here every week. Equipment worth millions of Reichsmarks. Scientists, engineers, all heading to some facility in Poland none of us are supposed to know about. And we just stamp the forms and file the paperwork." Mitchell kept his expression neutral, continuing to work. "I prefer boring work. Boring keeps you alive." That's what Jurgens thought. De Vos leaned against the desk. "Heart attack. That's what they told you, right?" Mitchell looked up slowly. What else would it be? De Vos tapped his nose. Jurgens was curious. Started asking questions about those special shipments. Then one night, he has a heart attack in his apartment. Very convenient. He pushed off from the desk. "Just advice, Henrik. Don't be curious." After De Vos left, Mitchell sat motionless for several minutes. If Jurgens had been eliminated for showing interest in the mystery shipments, then the security around this operation was extreme. But it also meant he was onto something significant. 2 nights later, Mitchell made his move. He'd identified a pattern in the guard rotations. A 15-minute window when the night watchman would be at the far end of the depot. Using a copied key he'd carefully made from a wax impression weeks earlier, he entered the records office. The special shipment files were kept in a locked cabinet. Mitchell's hands were steady as he picked the lock, another skill from his training that he'd hoped never to use in the field. Inside were manifests for the past 6 months. The destination codes matched what he'd suspected, Auschwitz. But these weren't deportation transports. The cargo listings referenced industrial equipment, chemical processing apparatus, precision instruments. And the personnel manifests listed scientists and engineers, some with familiar names from Germany's academic institutions. He was photographing documents with a miniature camera concealed in his pocket watch when he heard footsteps in the corridor. Mitchell moved instantly, returning files to the cabinet, closing the lock, slipping behind a row of filing cabinets. The door opened. Through a gap in the cabinets, he saw Amélie, the French secretary. She moved directly to the same cabinet he'd just closed, opened it with her own key, and pulled out several files. Mitchell watched as she produced her own camera and began photographing documents. A resistance operative, working under the same cover he was. The irony was almost amusing. But then he noticed something else. She was selecting specific files, ones he'd already photographed, and she was lingering over certain pages that had seemed less relevant to him. After she left, Mitchell waited 20 minutes before slipping out. Back in his room, he developed a film in a makeshift darkroom he'd created in the boarding house bathroom. The images confirmed his suspicions about the shipments, but Amelie's interest suggested there was another layer to this operation. The next morning, he took a calculated risk. As Amelie delivered paperwork to his desk, he spoke quietly in French, not the Dutch or German typically used in the office. The night watchman changes his route every Tuesday. 15 minutes is enough time, but only if you know exactly what you're looking for. She froze for just an instant, her professional mask slipping. Her response came in equally quiet French. The café on Klosterstraat. 1 hour after closing time. Tonight. The café was dark when Mitchell arrived, slipping through an unlocked back door as instructed. Amelie sat at a table with two other figures, a grizzled older man and Marie, his original contact, the resistance cell, or a trap. Henrik Vandewalle doesn't exist, the older man said without preamble. He died in Rotterdam. So who are you really? Mitchell had prepared for this moment since arriving in Belgium. Does it matter? We're after the same information. It matters if you're Gestapo trying to roll up our network. If I were Gestapo, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You'd already be in cells. Mitchell pulled out one of his photographs. These shipments aren't weapons. They're building something. Some kind of industrial facility, possibly research-related, at Auschwitz. The question is what, and why the extreme security? Marie spoke. We've lost people trying to answer that question. The Germans are paranoid about any interest in these shipments, which means they're valuable enough to kill for. Mitchell spread more photographs on the table. But here's what troubles me more. Someone is feeding the Germans intelligence about Allied bomber operations. The timing of these shipments coincides perfectly with gaps in our reconnaissance flights. That's not luck. The older man, who'd introduced himself only as Bernard, studied the photographs. We've suspected a leak for months. Someone with access to British operational planning. Not just access, Mitchell said. Detailed knowledge, real-time updates. That suggests someone in communications or intelligence operations in England. Amelie leaned forward. We've been trying to identify what these shipments contain. There are coded references in the manifests. We think it's heavy water, uranium compounds, maybe both. The implications hit Mitchell like a physical blow. An atomic research program. The British and Americans knew the Germans were pursuing nuclear weapons, but if they'd progressed far enough to be shipping refined materials to a dedicated research facility, the timeline for the war might be drastically different than Allied planners assumed. We need to stop these shipments, Bernard said. Sabotage the rail lines, destroy the cargo. No. Mitchell's response was immediate. If we disrupt the shipments, they'll know someone has penetrated their operation. They'll change procedures, routes, everything. We'll lose our insight completely. Then what do you propose? Let them build their weapon? I propose we let them think the shipments are secure while we feed this intelligence back to London. Let them commit resources to this program while our people work on countermeasures. And more importantly, we use this to find the leak. Marie shook her head. How? Mitchell had been working this problem since its first week. The timing of these shipments is too precise. Someone is providing the German logistics command with advance notice of Allied reconnaissance schedules. If we can identify when that information is being passed, we can narrow down the source. And how do we do that without exposing ourselves? We don't. But I can create a situation that forces the leak to act on a specific timeline. We just need to set the right bait. Over the next week, Mitchell implemented his plan. Using his position in the freight office, he began documenting every detail of the mystery shipments, Dates, times, manifest numbers, escort details. He established a pattern of working late, often being the last person in the office, and he made sure certain people noticed his interest. The trap was set during a casual conversation with DeVos. Mitchell mentioned, as if making small talk, that he'd noticed some irregularities in the special shipment manifests. Nothing concerning, probably just data entry errors. But it seemed odd that several shipments listed cargo weights that didn't match the railcar capacity specifications. DeVos's response was too casual, too quick. I wouldn't worry about it. Those special manifests get handled at a higher level. Not our concern. But Mitchell saw the flicker in his eyes. Concern. Calculation. Fear. 2 days later, the surveillance on Mitchell intensified. The watches became more obvious, more aggressive. He was being squeezed, pushed to see if he'd break cover, if he'd try to make contact with outside handlers. He maintained his routine, but he also began leaving subtle signs for the resistance cell. Chalk marks on specific walls, folded newspapers on parked benches, the classic tradecraft of clandestine communication. The message he sent was simple. The leak had been triggered. Someone had reported his interest in the shipments up the chain of command, and that someone was likely DeVos. But the real question was who DeVos was reporting to, and how that information was being passed to Germany. The answer came in a way Mitchell never expected. 3 days after his conversation with DeVos, a new supervisor arrived at the depot. Obersturmbannführer Karl Schneider, SS Intelligence, ostensibly there to improve operational efficiency. In reality, he was there to investigate the security breach represented by Mitchell's questions. Schneider was everything Mitchell feared in an opponent. Intelligent, methodical, and completely ruthless. He began interviewing staff members, reviewing files, checking procedures. And he paid particular attention to Henrik Vandewalle. "You're very thorough in your work," Schneider observed during their interview, reviewing Mitchell's meticulously maintained logs. "Almost too thorough. Most clerks do the minimum required. You document everything." Mitchell had prepared for this. "I was taught that precision in record-keeping prevents problems later. I've seen freight operations fall apart because someone couldn't find a manifest or verify a shipment code." A professional attitude. Rare these days. Schneider closed the logbook. "Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual in your time here? Any irregularities in procedures, suspicious behavior among the staff?" The question was a test. Answer too quickly, and he'd seem rehearsed. Hesitate too long, and he'd seem evasive. Mitchell took his time, as if actually considering the question. Luke DeVos has access to files he shouldn't. I've seen him reviewing special shipment manifests after hours. I assumed he had authorization, but it always seemed odd. Schneider's expression didn't change, but Mitchell saw the microscopic shift in his posture. Interest. "Why didn't you report this?" "It wasn't my place. I'm a freight clerk, not security. And like I said, I assumed he had authorization." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, but Mitchell knew the seed had been planted. By pointing suspicion at DeVos, he created doubt and confusion in the German security apparatus. If DeVos was the leak, Mitchell had exposed him. If DeVos wasn't the leak, then the real source might panic and make a mistake. That night, Mitchell returned to his boarding house to find it had been searched. Professional work. Everything returned to nearly the exact position it had been, but small tells gave it away. A book on his nightstand oriented slightly differently. Dust on the windowsill disturbed. His clothing folded in a pattern he didn't use. He sat on the bed and waited. Either he'd successfully deflected suspicion onto DeVos, or the Gestapo would come for him tonight. There was nothing to do now but see which way the knife fell. The knock came at 2 in the morning. Mitchell answered to find Marie, her face pale in the darkness. "You need to leave. Now. Schneider has ordered your arrest. You have maybe an hour." "What about the mission?" "The mission is over. We're pulling you out before they break you and roll up the entire network." Mitchell grabbed his escape kit, forged papers, money, a concealed pistol, and followed Marie through the dark streets. But as they moved through an alley shortcut, he saw them, German soldiers, establishing a checkpoint ahead. Behind them, more troops. They were being herded into a kill box. "It's a trap," Mitchell said quietly. Marie's hand moved to her coat, but Mitchell was faster. He grabbed her wrist, twisted, and came away with her pistol. "You're the leak, not DeVos. You've been compromised, probably for months." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. The Gestapo has something on you. Family, probably. They turned you, and you've been feeding them information about Allied operations in exchange for protection. How many agents have you delivered to them?" Tears ran down her face, but her voice was steel. "My daughter. They have my daughter. What would you have done?" Mitchell felt no anger, only the cold calculation of survival. "I would have told my handlers immediately. We could have used it, turned it back on the Germans. But you kept quiet, and now people are dead because of you." The German troops were moving closer, tightening the net. Mitchell had seconds to decide. He could shoot Marie and try to fight his way out. Probably suicide. He could surrender and hope for prisoner exchange, unlikely for a captured spy. Or he could run and abandon the mission intelligence. He chose none of those options. Instead, he pressed the pistol into Marie's hand. "Tell them I forced you to help me. Tell them I was suspicious and held you at gunpoint. You discovered I was British intelligence and tried to stop me. That's your story. Why? Because your daughter deserves a mother. And because I need you to deliver a message to the resistance. The shipments are nuclear materials. The facility at Auschwitz is an atomic research installation. And the real leak isn't in Belgium. It's in London, someone with access to operational planning. That information needs to reach British intelligence." Before Marie could respond, Mitchell ran, not toward escape, but toward the German checkpoint. He fired 3 shots in the air, enough to announce his position and direction, but not actually hit anyone. The soldiers reacted predictably, returning fire and giving chase. Mitchell led them on a winding route through Antwerp's industrial district, using every trick of urban evasion he'd learned. He doubled back, used rooftops, crawled through sewers, and slowly, he began to lose them. Not because he was particularly skilled at escape and evasion, but because he understood something the Germans didn't. He wasn't trying to escape. He was buying time. By dawn, Mitchell had made his way to an emergency fallback point, a warehouse owned by a Belgian shipping company that secretly supported the resistance. Inside, he found Bernard and Amelie waiting. "Marie," Bernard asked. "Compromised, but she might still be useful if she survives." Mitchell collapsed against a wall, exhausted. "Did you get my message about the leak being in London?" Bernard nodded. "Already passed to your people through a different channel. But Mitchell, you can't stay in Belgium. Every German in the country will be looking for you." "I know, but there's one more thing I need to do." 3 nights later, a massive explosion destroyed the freight depot's records office. The fire consumed 6 months of manifests, shipping records, and logistical data. It would take the Germans weeks to reconstruct their operations, and in that time, Allied intelligence would have a window to act on the information Mitchell had gathered. Mitchell himself was evacuated through a resistance smuggling route, hidden in a shipment of machine parts that traveled from Belgium to France to Spain to Gibraltar. 2 months after arriving in Antwerp, he stood in a debriefing room in London, exhausted and 20 pounds lighter, reporting everything he'd learned. The intelligence he'd gathered proved crucial. The atomic research program at Auschwitz was real, but less advanced than feared. Allied bombing campaigns were redirected to target the facility's supply lines. And the leak in London was eventually identified. A low-level communications clerk with gambling debts who'd been blackmailed by German intelligence. He was quietly arrested and executed. Marie survived her interrogation, apparently convincing the Germans she'd been duped by a clever British agent. Her daughter was released from custody 2 months later. Mitchell never learned if she continued working with the resistance or simply tried to survive the rest of the war. He preferred to believe she'd done what any parent would do, protected her child, even if it meant making impossible compromises. As for Henrik Vandewalle, that identity was burned. The carefully constructed cover had lasted exactly 5 weeks and 3 days before being exposed. But in that brief window, Mitchell had penetrated one of Germany's most sensitive operations, identified a critical intelligence leak, and provided information that potentially saved thousands of lives. Years after the war, Mitchell would be asked about his experience in occupied Belgium. He always gave the same answer. I pushed papers in a freight office for a few weeks. Nothing dramatic. Just another boring logistics job. But late at night, when the memories returned, he would think about the people he'd met. Bernard, who continued fighting the Germans until liberation. Amelie, who survived the war and became a teacher. De Vos, who was never the leak, but died anyway when the depot was bombed. And Marie, forced into impossible choices by an impossible situation. The work of intelligence officers, Mitchell learned, wasn't about heroic action or dramatic confrontations. It was about patience, observation, and understanding that everyone involved, on all sides, was simply trying to survive in a world that demanded the impossible. The real skill wasn't in fighting. It was in seeing the patterns, understanding the people, and knowing when to act and when to wait. And sometimes, it was about recognizing that the enemy wasn't always the person in a different uniform. Sometimes it was the situation itself. The war that forced ordinary people into extraordinary circumstances where there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. The ghost of Antwerp, that's what the German security services called the British agent who'd penetrated their operations and vanished. They never connected the ghost to a mild-mannered Dutch freight clerk named Henrik Vandewalle, and James Mitchell never corrected them. Some secrets, he believed, were better left buried in the archives of history, known only to the handful of people who lived through them and understood what they really meant. Not tales of heroism or adventure, but stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the shadows, making impossible choices in a world at war, and somehow finding the courage to keep moving forward, one decision at a time.